Have you ever woken up with the unshakable feeling that something was watching you? Not paranoia, not imagination, but something real. Have you ever felt death enter the room and known it was meant for you? The artificial dawn was just beginning to seep through the curved panoramic windows of my apartment on level 42. New Avalon Station, home to over 10 million souls drifting somewhere between stars and ambition, was slowly coming to life. Lights flickered on across towers of polished alloy and glowing glass. Machines hummed to full consciousness. Schedules resumed. Everything moved with mechanical purpose. Except me. I lay still beneath a gray sheet, muscles relaxed, eyes closed, breath slow and measured. But I was not asleep. Something had shifted in the room. A pressure. A presence. One that did not belong. After 16 years in intelligence, your instincts sharpen beyond thought. You learn to trust the invisible. I knew I was not alone. The air carried no sound, but it did carry intent. A predatory stillness hung above me like a coiled spring. Whoever had entered bypassed 7 levels of biometric security and had done it without tripping a single silent alarm. Alarms I personally designed. That should have been impossible, which meant they were here for me. I listened for movement. Nothing. I kept still. I needed them closer. And then it happened. A shift in weight on the floor. A faint displacement of air. The press of a shadow drawing near. The sheet covering my body felt like paper armor. I opened my eyes. She was standing above me, blade in hand, hair dark as the void, spilling down over shoulders draped in midnight-colored leather. Her skin, green, not sickly, but luminous, like the polished surface of deep jade, and her eyes, twin orbs of molten amber, locked with mine in a moment that lasted forever and no time at all. My voice emerged rough, still playing the part of someone only just roused. "Well," I said, "this is awkward." Her expression didn't change. "What's under the sheet?" she asked, voice sharp and accented. "A weapon?" I arched a brow, keeping my tone light despite the razor in her hand. "Only standard-issue male anatomy, morning condition, if we're being specific." Her brow furrowed, her grip tightened on the blade. "You mock me. I'd never. I just didn't expect the Emerald Conclave to send assassins who dress like high-fashion murder goddesses." "You were warned." She took a step forward. I did not move. "Prepare yourself." "No thanks." I moved. Years of training kicked in. I rolled left, twisting the sheet with me, catching her wrist mid-strike. The knife slashed the air above my shoulder. I used her momentum to pull her off balance. We fell together. She landed on top of me. We froze. The blade was inches from my throat. Her breathing had quickened, mine too. The gray sheet hung between us like a fading barrier, half tangled between combat and something else entirely. Her legs straddled my hips. Her hair tickled my face. Her skin, impossibly warm, brushed against my chest. She blinked, once, twice, then her cheeks darkened, emerald green shading deeper. "This is not—" She leapt off me like she'd been burned. The blade disappeared back into her arm sheath in a whisper of steel. Before I could speak again, she moved toward the window, and then she was gone. I lay there for a moment, stunned, the remnants of adrenaline and arousal tangled up in my bloodstream. I stared at the ceiling. That, I muttered, was one hell of a way to say good morning. I dressed quickly and moved to my terminal. The security feeds had been scrubbed. No trace of entry, no fingerprints, no signal. Whoever she wasn't just an assassin, she was elite. But she had hesitated. And that meant she wasn't just an assassin either. I ran facial scans against every known database. Emerald Conclave warriors, Diplomatic agents, mercenaries, spies, no match. Except, I had a feeling I hadn't seen the last of her. I didn't have to wait long. 3 hours later, I was summoned to the council chambers. The briefing room was stark and cold, lined with curved glass and polished steel. At the head of the oval table stood Admiral Wells. Tall, silver-haired, his expression as hard as the ship's hull. "Commander Thorne," he said as I entered. "Admiral, take a seat, there's someone you should meet." I followed his gaze, and there she was. Standing at the far end of the table in a form-fitting diplomatic uniform was the same woman who had straddled me with a knife to my throat earlier this morning. Her hair was pulled back now. Her skin seemed to shimmer under the council room's sterile lighting. And those amber eyes, they didn't flinch when they met mine. "Commander Galen Thorne," Admiral Wells said. "Meet Ambassador Saren Vela of the Emerald Conclave." My jaw didn't drop, but only because I'd already lost all capacity for surprise. "Well," I said, taking a seat across from her, "we really must stop meeting like this." Her expression didn't waver, but her fingers curled slightly on the edge of the table. "Commander," she replied smoothly, "this morning's encounter was unsanctioned." I smiled. Must be part of some new diplomatic protocol. Admiral Wells glanced between us, suspicion deepening. "Ambassador?" She drew in a slow breath. "In our culture," she said, "it is tradition. When one of significance emerges, they are tested." "Tested?" Wells repeated flatly. She nodded. "Our way, the dance of blades. It is not an act of hostility, it is courtship." Wells sat down, clearly re-evaluating the meaning of international relations. I couldn't help it. I looked her straight in the eye. And did I pass? For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not a smile, not quite, but something. "You are intriguing," she said. "Well," I said, leaning back, "I do try." The briefing continued. Topics shifted to interspecies protocols, station security, cooperative monitoring. But I wasn't listening. I was watching her, and she was watching me. A knife had nearly opened my throat this morning. Now, something else entirely was opening. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. What if the person sent to end your life was now sitting across the table from you, speaking the language of peace, but still watching you like prey? Would you believe her new title, or trust the look in her eyes? It had been 2 days since the morning I woke up with a blade at my throat, since the moment her amber eyes locked with mine and something ancient passed between us. A question, a hesitation, maybe even recognition. And now, Ambassador Saren Vela had become a regular feature of New Avalon's diplomatic landscape. The council called it a cultural exchange initiative. I called it complicated. Today, she stood at the edge of the garden promenade, flanked by artificial trees that reached toward the arched dome above us. Through the transparent canopy, the stars stretched like frozen fire, silent, watching. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle her, as if I could. "You're early," she said without turning. "Old military habit," I replied. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys waiting." "I don't." She looked over her shoulder. "But I enjoy being prepared." She was dressed in a flowing emerald-toned robe, the kind that shimmered when it caught the light. It should have looked ceremonial, decorative, but nothing about Saren Vela ever looked soft. Even standing still, she radiated purpose, and underneath that elegance, the killer still waited, measured, patient, alert. She motioned to the bench beside her. "Walk with me?" I nodded, falling into step. The garden curved in slow arcs. The air was warm, laced with the faint scent of engineered blossom. Beneath the hum of the life support systems, music played, barely audible. An old Earth jazz loop someone had programmed centuries ago. We walked in silence for a while, then she spoke. "You've been monitoring me." I didn't bother to deny it. "I monitor all diplomatic arrivals, especially those who've tried to kill me in their sleep." She stopped walking, facing me. "I wasn't going to kill you, Galen." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. The knife must have been for slicing breakfast. Her mouth twitched. Almost a smile, almost. It was a test, one I didn't expect to fail. That caught me. "You failed?" She tilted her head. "I didn't strike. Because I disarmed you." "No," she said, her voice lower. "Because I hesitated." I searched her face. "Why?" Her gaze dropped momentarily, just long enough to be noticeable. "You were not what I expected." Silence settled between us again, but this time it wasn't tense, it was charged. We sat on the bench beneath a false cherry blossom, petals falling in a looped holographic cycle. "I've read about your people's traditions," I said finally. "The dance of blades, trial by combat, courtship through challenge. And you think we're savages?" "No," I said. "I think you've never met someone who refused to dance." She looked at me then, really looked. "You weren't afraid." "I was half naked." "That's not an answer." "No," I admitted, "it's not." A long pause. The air seemed thicker now. "Why did you run?" I asked. "When?" "That morning, after you landed on top of me." She exhaled, slow and controlled. "Because my heart rate spiked, because I felt heat in my blood I wasn't trained to feel, and because I forgot why I was there." "You remembered pretty quickly." "I ran to remember," she said, "but by then it was too late." I leaned back, watching the play of starlight in her hair. "You know, you're not what I expected either." She glanced sideways. "What did you expect?" "A killer, cold, precise, efficient." "And what did you find?" "Someone who blushes when things get intimate." Her cheeks darkened just slightly, but she didn't look away. "My people see intimacy differently." "How so?" "We fight to test compatibility. Those who cannot withstand each other physically cannot survive emotionally. Love is earned through struggle, through blood." I nodded slowly. "Sounds messy." "It is," she paused. "But so is peace." Those last 3 words hung in the air like a chord waiting for resolution. "Tell me," I said after a moment, "was I compatible?" She didn't answer at first, but her eyes softened. "You were unexpected." "I'll take that as a maybe." She smiled then, a real one, small, quiet, dangerous. "Among my people," she said, "you'd be considered provocative." "I get that a lot." She turned toward me, resting her hands on her lap. "I've received messages," she said. "From my superiors, they're not pleased." "Because of me?" "Because I didn't kill you, because I didn't report the encounter, because I chose to speak with you instead." I studied her. "And what did you tell them?" "That you were clever, that you were dangerous, and that I needed more time." "To kill me?" She didn't answer, not with words. She leaned forward instead, just slightly. "Do you want me to?" Our faces were inches apart now. I could feel her breath. "You're asking the wrong question," I said. "What's the right one?" "Do you want to?" She pulled back, but only a little. "I don't know." I stood slowly, offering her my hand. "Then, let's find out." She hesitated, then placed her hand in mine. It was warm, strong, and trembling, just slightly. As we walked back toward the council chamber, the stars above continued their eternal vigil, unblinking and unmoved. But something had shifted. Something quiet, powerful, and utterly irreversible. How close can you sit beside someone who once meant to kill you before the line between enemy and something else begins to blur? And when that line blurs, what's left to hold on to except instinct and the sound of your own heartbeat? The lights of New Avalon Station dimmed to their nocturnal setting, casting the corridors in shades of violet and soft blue. It was the quietest time on the station, a hush that felt deeper than silence, where the air vibrated with a kind of unspoken tension. People slept, systems rested, but not everyone did, not her and not me. I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters, staring at the reflection of a man who had survived wars, betrayals, and now, an assassin who made him question everything. My uniform jacket hung open, the collar slightly creased from the way she'd gripped it earlier that afternoon. I remembered the exact moment her hand brushed mine in the council garden. The sharp contrast of warmth, the subtle hesitation in her touch, the faint tremble she tried so hard to hide, and the way she didn't pull away. The door chimed. I didn't need to ask who it was. "Enter," I said. The panel slid open, and she stepped inside. Seren Vela, no title, no formal uniform. Just her, dressed in a long dark coat, the kind worn by off-duty agents, the kind meant to conceal, not decorate. Her hair was looser now, falling in soft waves down her back. But the glint in her eyes, amber and dangerous, was still very much present. "You asked to meet privately," she said. No preamble, no hesitation. I did. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, scanning every detail like she always did, every shadow, every angle, every threat. "I ran a background check," I said. Her gaze snapped to mine. "On me? Standard procedure. I'm still the chief of station intelligence, after all." She nodded once. "And? You're not just a diplomat. You're not just a warrior. You're someone they sent when they didn't want anyone else to know." She didn't deny it. "I'm the quiet solution," she said, "the one that never shows up in official reports. And now you're here, standing in my quarters. No blade, no mask, just you." For a long beat, we didn't speak. Then she reached into her coat, slowly, deliberately, and removed a small, curved blade. It wasn't ceremonial, it was intimate, compact, worn by use, not display. She placed it gently on the table between us. "I brought it in case," she said. "In case of what? In case I needed to remind myself who I was supposed to be. And now?" She looked at the blade, then at me. "I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be anymore." I stepped around the table, close, closer, until we stood just 2 feet apart. "What do you see when you look at me now, Seren?" Her eyes searched mine, carefully, quietly. "A threat," she said. "But not to my life." "To what, then?" She breathed out slowly. "To everything I was trained to believe." We stood like that in the low light, 2 shadows caught between duty and something far more fragile. "I haven't stopped thinking about that morning," I said. Her voice lowered. "Nor have I. I keep replaying the moment you froze. Not because I think it saved my life, but because I wonder what you saw that made you stop." She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, closer than comfort allowed. Her fingers reached up, brushing the collar of my shirt, smoothing the crease she had left hours ago. "I saw myself," she said, "and I didn't like what I saw." I placed my hand over hers. "I did." Her breath caught. "You're making this dangerous," she whispered. It was already dangerous. Her fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt. "They'll come for me," she said, "if they find out how close I've come to—" She didn't finish. "To defecting," I offered. "No," she said, "to feeling. That word, so simple, so human, shook something in both of us. I reached for her other hand. She didn't resist. "We could stop," I said. "Call this what it was. A cultural misunderstanding. Go back to protocol." "Would you believe it?" "No," I said, "and neither would you." Her hand pressed flat against my chest, right over my heartbeat. "Your heart," she said. "It's steady. So is yours." She looked up, eyes wide with something between wonder and disbelief. "I was sent to end you," she said. "I know. I wanted to, for the first 3 seconds. I know." She leaned in, her voice a breath. "But then, I looked at your eyes, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years." "What?" "Recognition." That word again. I pulled her closer, not forcefully, just enough to bridge the final space between us. "Then let's stop pretending we don't know what this is." She didn't speak. Her hand found my cheek. Her lips brushed mine. And in that moment, the blade on the table wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a memory of who she had been and who she no longer wished to be. We kissed, slow, certain. Not out of lust, not out of confusion, but out of something ancient, something inevitable. When we finally parted, she whispered, "I should go. You should stay." She hesitated, then nodded. Later, as she lay beside me, half wrapped in sheets, her eyes found mine again. "I've never stayed the night before. Then, we're already breaking the rules." She smiled, small and real. "Good." The stars outside kept watching, but tonight they blinked a little slower. What do you do when your instincts scream danger, but your heart won't let you run? When the safest choice is distance, but everything inside you aches to be close? The silence in my quarters the next morning wasn't empty. It was full of memory, full of questions, full of the lingering scent of her skin on my sheets, and the way her voice had cracked when she whispered my name in the dark. Seren Vela had stayed the night. Not because she had to, not because it was part of some diplomatic manipulation, but because, for the first time, neither of us could think of a reason not to. She moved like she always did, carefully, fluidly, like a weapon deciding not to strike. And yet there was no blade in her hand when she approached me over coffee. Just a cup and a silence that felt intimate. I watched her sip the bitter liquid, her face unreadable. "How is it?" I asked. "Hot," she said. "Bitter, curious." "Describes me perfectly." Her lips twitched just a little. "You are changing things." "Me?" I arched a brow. "I'm the one who got seduced by my would-be killer." "You weren't seduced." I smiled. "No, you're not that easy." I set the mug down and leaned forward. "Then what was last night?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lowered to the table between us, then back to mine. "Unrepeatable," she said. I felt something cold slide under my ribs. "Because it was a mistake?" "No," she said quietly. "Because if we do it again, I won't be able to stop." Her honesty landed with the force of a weapon more precise than any she'd ever carried. There were footsteps outside, a pause, then a chime. She was on her feet before I could move. "Expecting someone?" she asked, voice low, cautious. "No." I opened the door. Admiral Wells stood there, arms crossed, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, then paused as his eyes flicked over my shoulder and caught sight of Seren. Her coat was back on. Her hair pulled quickly into a tight twist, but the signs were there, the tension in her shoulders, the distance between us. The Admiral's jaw tightened. He didn't say a word, but I could feel the disapproval like static in the air. "Now," he added. I nodded once. "Give me 5 minutes." He left without another word. When I closed the door, Seren was already at the window, staring at the artificial horizon stretching out across New Avalon's upper dome. "They know," she said. "They suspect," I corrected. "Big difference." "Not for my people." I crossed the room and stopped just behind her. "They'll come for you?" I asked. She nodded. "Eventually." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we plan." She turned to face me. "You don't get it. There is no plan. There's only exile or execution." I didn't flinch. Neither did she. "Then we rewrite the rules," I said. She stepped closer. "Do you know what you're saying?" "Yes." "You're risking your career, your name, your entire command." I looked her in the eye. "I'm risking it for something that didn't try to kill me last night." She smiled then. Sad. Software. "That was mercy." "No," I said. "That was choice." The room was quiet again, but it didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt like a decision had been made. She picked up her blade from the table, the same one she'd placed there the night before, and slid it into the sheath beneath her sleeve. "This time," she said, "it stays there." I nodded. "Good." She moved toward the door, paused, then turned back. "I'm due in the lower ring at 1400, trade negotiations. I'll find you after." "You shouldn't." "I will." She didn't argue, and then she was gone. Later that day, I stood before Admiral Wells in the council chamber. He didn't mince words. "There's chatter," he said, "about you and the ambassador. Chatter's never in short supply." He leaned forward. "Tell me it's not true." I didn't respond. "I gave you this command because you were stable, because you didn't let things get personal. I'm still that man." "Then prove it. Distance yourself." I met his eyes. "I can't." His silence was answer enough. "You have a target on your back now," he said. "So does she." I nodded. "Then we face it." "Together?" "Yes." The Admiral sighed, not with disappointment, but with the weight of understanding. "This ends one of two ways," he said. "I know." But deep inside, I didn't care which, because for the first time, the cold edge of duty had been replaced by something warmer. The beginning of something that wasn't supposed to happen, and already couldn't be undone. What happens when the past you tried to walk away from refuses to let you go? When the choices you thought were personal turn out to be political? How far are you willing to go to protect something that was never meant to survive? The attack didn't come with warning. No alarms, no coded threats, no intercepted transmissions. Just a power fluctuation in Section 12, a flicker in the light grids, a cooling anomaly in the station's environmental controls. I would have missed it if I didn't know exactly what to look for. That flicker was how they always started. I stood in my office, facing the main security display. Nothing on the logs, no breach. But the energy profile told a different story. The signature was subtle, like someone trying too hard to be invisible. But I'd seen it before. I'd written half the protocols they were trying to avoid. Emerald assassins were on the station. They weren't here to talk. I tapped the comm embedded in my collar. "Seren, now, meet me at safe point 3. Her voice came back, low and calm. "Understood." Then silence. I moved quickly, sealing the office behind me with a biometric override. The corridor outside was empty, the lights now running in passive mode, disguising the subtle shift into lockdown. I didn't draw my weapon, not yet. I needed to move fast, not loud. Every instinct screamed what I didn't want to admit. They weren't here for me. They were here for her. She met me 2 levels down, already in her off-duty combat gear. The coat was gone. Her eyes were sharp. Her hair pulled tight. The blade at her thigh wasn't ceremonial anymore. "How many?" she asked. "At least 4, could be more." Splitting their approach through maintenance shafts, I caught their signal, barely. "They're elite," she said. "Royal caste?" She nodded once. "They'll try to isolate, divide us." "They're expecting fear," I said. "We give them strategy." We moved together through side corridors, silent and certain. Months of military training had honed my instincts. Years of assassin conditioning had sharpened hers. But it was the last few nights, lying side by side, watching the lights flicker across the ceiling as secrets unfolded in the dark. That had created something else, something that moved like a unit. Two minds, one purpose: survive, protect each other. We reached the auxiliary junction by the engineering wing. A narrow corridor intersected by 3 maintenance shafts. Exactly the kind of place you'd set up a kill zone if you wanted to trap someone who thought they were being clever. They were already there. 3 figures in cloaks designed to disrupt station lighting. Tall, silent. Blades curved in reverse arc, meant to sever before sound followed. Seren raised her weapon. I didn't move. The leader stepped forward. His face was partially covered, but his eyes, those same molten amber tones, held nothing but command. "Seren Vela," he said, "you were warned." Her voice was ice. I was told to obey. "And you refused?" Number Y evolved. They didn't respond with words. They attacked. It was sudden, brutal, efficient. Seren deflected the first strike, her blade catching his at the base of the hilt and twisting with a practiced flick. I dropped low, pulling my sidearm and firing 2 concussive rounds into the shadows behind them. One hit, one missed. The corridor echoed with the blast of kinetic force. We fell back, not fleeing, maneuvering. "This way," I called. Seren moved ahead, covering our flank. I watched her movements. Calculated violence paired with a grace that belonged on a battlefield, not a diplomatic envoy list. Her blade flashed in the low light, cutting through a second attacker who had dropped from the overhead duct. Blood. Real now. Not metaphorical. We reached a sealed corridor leading toward the emergency override station, a control hub I'd personally reprogrammed months ago during a station retrofit. I keyed in my access code. The door hissed open. We slid through, locking it behind us. We didn't speak. There was no time. Seren dropped her blade on the floor, breathing hard, blood on her sleeve, not hers. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "For now." I activated the internal defense grid. A pulse shimmered through the walls, temporary. 10 minutes at most. "They're not here to take me," she said, voice low. "They're here to make an example. That means they'll keep coming." She looked at me. "Then we make sure we're not easy targets." She walked toward me. Slowly, not to attack, but because the space between us had become something sacred, unspoken, desperate in the way that only danger can make it. "I should have left," she said. The moment I realized what I felt. "But you didn't." "No," she said, "because I wanted this." I touched her hand. "You still have it." She closed her eyes, leaned her forehead against mine. "I won't survive exile," she said, "but I'll survive this if you're with me. I'm not going anywhere." The silence around us throbbed. Not empty, not full of fear, just honest. When the pulse barrier cracked, when the walls flickered and the countdown hit 0, we were ready. She stood at my side, blade in one hand, a second now tucked into her belt. I adjusted the targeting scope on my sidearm, recalibrated the EMP shell, and locked eyes with the only person I trusted in the universe. They would come. They would try to erase this moment from existence, but we would write it in fire. And if history remembered anything of New Avalon, it would remember that on this day, a soldier and an assassin stood together, not for conquest, not for politics, but because love, once chosen, does not retreat. What do you do when survival is no longer about staying alive, but protecting something you never thought you could have? What happens when love stops being soft and becomes sharp enough to cut through destiny? The corridors of New Avalon bled chaos. The Royal Hunt had breached Sector 3, and the station's interior alarms now blared in urgent, looping waves. Red lighting pulsed through the walls, casting everything in a crimson hue that made metal look like blood, and made every shadow look like a weapon waiting to strike. Saren Vela and I ran shoulder to shoulder through the side access shaft behind the command deck. Every turn we took was a path I'd memorized months ago. I'd helped design these systems, written their failure points, hidden their blind spots. Now I used all of it to keep her alive. "They're moving in staggered formation," I said, glancing at my HUD. 2 units flanking from opposite sides of the command ring. Fast, aggressive, they're hurting us. "They want to corner us," she answered, her voice steady. "Then shame me in death, let it echo through the conclave." "Too bad, I don't believe in shame." Her mouth twitched in the smallest flicker of a grin. "Neither do I." We dropped into a service shaft behind Medical Level 6. A few years ago, it had been repurposed for cooling conduits. Now, it was a perfect bottleneck, a place they'd think we'd try to avoid. Perfect. Seren crouched behind a vent brace, blade drawn, breath even. I watched her in the low light, sweat glistening against the emerald sheen of her skin, amber eyes alert, glowing like a silent fire in the dark. "You were born for this," I murmured. She looked at me, eyes narrowing. "No," she said, "I was made for this, but what I was born for, I'm only just beginning to learn." The footfalls echoed first, barely perceptible. No words, no orders, just the quiet certainty of elite killers who didn't need to speak to understand each other. They moved as one. 4 shapes emerged from the dark. I fired first. 2 concussive pulses detonated along the vent shaft, followed by a precision EMP round that shorted the optic visors on the first hunter's mask. He stumbled, but not enough. Seren moved before he could recover. Her blade struck fast and brutal, slicing tendon and disabling his dominant arm in one clean motion. The others reacted. Too late. We'd danced this rhythm before. What made it different now wasn't coordination, it was conviction. I fired another burst and took down the second attacker with a shot to the knee. Seren went high, flipping off the wall and landing behind the third. Her foot cracked into his back, sending him forward into my reach. I slammed the butt of my pistol into the base of his skull. He dropped, unconscious. 3 down. The last one stepped forward, taller, heavier, blade in each hand, the leader. "I warned you," he said to her. "You tried," she replied. "You are blade fallen," he said. "No honor, no name, no place." Seren stepped closer. I found something better. He moved with impossible speed. So did she. They clashed in a flurry of motion, steel and flesh and heat. Their blades met again and again, each strike sharper than the last. I could only watch, my weapon ready, but my gut telling me this wasn't my fight. It was hers. This was the moment her people had trained her for. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for her. It was for us. And when her blade finally found the gap beneath his armor, when it slid clean through with a gasp of breath and silence that followed like a bowstring snapping, I didn't cheer. I exhaled. Because I knew it cost her something. He collapsed at her feet. She stood over him, trembling. Not from weakness, but from everything that fight had taken out of her soul. I stepped forward, wrapping my arms around her. She didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm not," she whispered. We stood in silence as the station systems recalibrated, the emergency tones slowing to a low, pulsing hum. The station was safe, for now. But the damage was done. Not to the walls, to us, to everything that had once made this just a secret. It wasn't secret anymore. Word will spread, she said. They'll send more. Let them. They'll say I betrayed my caste, that I chose an outsider over my oath. And what will you say? I asked. She looked at me with those eyes I could never unsee. That I finally chose myself. That night, we didn't sleep. Not because we were afraid, but because we were done running. Because something fragile had survived the fire. Something we never expected to build. And we both knew this wasn't the end of the war. It was just the moment we stopped pretending it wasn't ours to fight. How do you explain to your commanding officers, to an entire species built on rules and war, that the thing they fear most isn't a weapon, but a connection, not strategy, not treason, but something simple and far more dangerous? Love. The aftermath of the attack left New Avalon running on half power. Sector 7 was sealed for structural assessment. Emergency crews worked in shifts to restore full environmental regulation. But none of that was the real emergency. The real emergency was political. I sat in front of the council chamber's black glass wall, watching the stars spin slowly beyond. Their movement was deceptive, beautiful, and meaningless. Stars never asked permission to burn, they just did. Behind me, the room filled with voices, commanders, senators, technicians, diplomats, all talking over one another, all trying to make sense of what had happened. Seren Vela stood beside me. Her arms were crossed, her hair drawn back tight, but not in preparation for battle. This time, it was armor for a different kind of war, the one where you bleed by standing still. Admiral Wells cleared his throat, silencing the room. Let the record show, he began, that 2 nights ago, New Avalon Station was infiltrated by a royal hunt cell from the Emerald Conclave. The targets were Commander Galen Thorne and Ambassador Seren Vela. A pause. Then the word no one wanted to say. Together, there it was. They didn't accuse us. Not directly, they didn't need to. The silence did the work for them. I take full responsibility, I said, rising from my seat. I engaged the station's emergency defense protocols. I neutralized threats using internal tactical overrides. You collaborated, someone interrupted. I didn't see who. You turned classified resources toward protecting an enemy agent. She's not an enemy, I said. They didn't believe it. They couldn't. Because if they did, they'd have to rethink everything. Seren stepped forward. My people will not admit this openly, she said, but the hunt was unsanctioned. A rogue faction within the conclave. They saw my actions as betrayal. I am, blade fallen now. That means nothing to you, perhaps. But to them, it is a death sentence. Then why come back here? Another voice asked. Why return to the station you nearly compromised? She didn't flinch, because I chose not to be what they made me. And what did you choose to be? The Admiral asked. Serene's answer was simple. I chose him. I watched the room react. Some leaned forward, others leaned back. A few turned away, but no one looked surprised. Because the truth had been circling us like a satellite for weeks. All it needed was someone brave enough to give it a name. She's not the first to cross a line for something human, I said, and I won't be the last. That may be, the Admiral said, but this station exists because of structure, because of rules. You two, whatever this is, you threaten that. Only if you let us, I replied. We weren't dismissed, we just left. The corridor outside the council chamber was darker than usual. Emergency lighting, still flickering from the breach. It cast moving shadows across the walls as Seren and I walked in silence. Finally, she stopped. "I don't regret it," she said. "I know. They won't protect us forever. They never were." She turned to me. "I don't care what they call me. Exile, traitor, blade fallen, none of it matters. You know what they'll call the child if we stay." She blinked. "You're assuming." I didn't smile. "I'm not assuming. I know." She placed her hand on my chest. "You want that?" "I want everything they said we couldn't have." The lights flickered again, this time longer. The station was tired, but still holding, just like us. We made our way back to my quarters, her steps slow, measured, not because of hesitation, because of weight. By the time the door closed behind us, the only light was starlight through the ceiling glass. She sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me the truth," she said, "all of it." I knelt in front of her. "When you came to kill me, I wasn't scared. I should have been, but I wasn't." "Why?" "Because I already felt something the second I looked at you. I didn't understand it. I still don't. But I knew it would change everything." She looked at me then, as if trying to find the line where trust became truth. "And if they come again?" "We fight. They won't stop." "Neither will I." She leaned forward, her forehead resting against mine. "I never wanted to fall in love. Neither did I. But I'm glad I did." The station trembled softly under our feet, pressures stabilizing, systems realigning. Some things, at least, were finding balance again, but not us. We weren't meant to balance. We were meant to burn. Have you ever found something worth dying for and then realized you'd do anything just to live for it instead? The stars above New Avalon spun slowly as the station entered another rotation. The emergency lighting was off now. The blast-sealed bulkheads had been retracted. System diagnostics returned to green across all panels. On the surface, the station had recovered. But the truth was, nothing had gone back to normal. Not for me, and not for Seren. We stayed out of sight for 3 days, not hiding, waiting, while the council argued behind closed doors, while messages were sent and recalled, while warships of both sides loomed at the system's edge, not engaging, but not retreating either. There was a weight in the air, like a storm that refused to break. Every glance in the corridors held extra seconds. Every silence carried judgment. People didn't know whether to call us heroes or traitors, lovers or threats, a warning or a beginning. But none of them said it out loud. No one dared, because even the ones who hated us the most could see what was happening. The galaxy was changing, and we were just the first crack in the wall. I stood at the viewport in the council observation chamber, watching as a transport ship crossed the light path between the outer ring and the moon below. Seren sat nearby, reading reports from her conclave contacts, what few remained. Her fingers scrolled the glowing data slowly, but her eyes didn't move. She was listening. To the silence. To me. To everything that hadn't yet been said. "The High Table convenes in less than a week," she murmured. "They'll vote on whether to recall me formally. And if they do?" She looked up. "They'll revoke my name, strip my caste. I'll no longer be Seren Vela. I'll be no one." I didn't hesitate. "Then you'll be mine." Her eyes softened, not with sentiment, with understanding, and something deeper. Resolve. "You know what that means," she said. "I do. If they see us as a union, they already do." She stood, walked to where I stood. No armor now, no blade, just her, just me. "What we have," she said, "was never supposed to survive past first contact. It did. And if we take one more step, it stops being personal. It becomes political, historical. I turned to her, touched her face, then let history tremble. Later that night, we entered the Hall of Alignment, not together. That would have been too loud for them. Instead, we came from opposite sides, flanked by guards who pretended not to see what they already knew. The chamber was ancient, preserved from the station's earliest construction. High ceilings, echoed footsteps. A dozen figures sat in a half circle, their robes black, their collars marked with silver. No expressions, no smiles, only judgment. Admiral Wells stood at the center dais. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. They began with formal charges, breach of conduct, fraternization under active conflict protocols, unauthorized coordination with foreign agents. Every word was cold, detached, and every word was true. Seren stood silent, until they turned to her. "You were ordered to assess potential threats," one of them said, "and instead you aligned yourself with one." She took a breath, then answered, voice even and quiet. "I aligned with a man who saved my life more than once, who showed mercy when I offered death, who stood with me not because of what I was, but because of who I could become." "And you expect us to believe that changes everything?" She looked directly at the speaker. "Number, I expect you to believe it changes something." I stepped forward. "The Emerald Conclave sent her here as a blade. We turned her into a voice." They fell silent. Not because they were convinced, but because they were afraid they might be. The vote was inconclusive. They delayed judgment. But they didn't imprison us. They didn't exile us. And sometimes, in this galaxy, that's the closest thing you get to victory. A week later, Seren and I stood on the launch platform. Not running, leaving, together. The stars outside glowed faintly blue. She watched the light ripple over the hull. "They'll send others," she said. I nodded. "I know." She reached for my hand. "And when they come, we'll show them," I said, "that love isn't a weakness. It's the reason we're still alive." The ramp lowered. The hatch opened. The world waited. We walked forward. Not toward safety, not toward exile, but toward something unclaimed, unwritten. A future that didn't exist until we made it. So if you've ever been told your love doesn't belong, that it breaks rules, defies blood, threatens the order of things, look at us. We weren't supposed to survive. But here we are, alive, together. And if our story means something to you, tell us. Share the moment. Speak the truth that someone else might be afraid to. Because in the end, survival is only part of the story. Choosing to live, that's what turns it into a legend.